Hello, Sean Munger here, and we're talking in this series about the historical context of the James Bond movies. In this video, we get to one of the most fascinating of the movies, You Only Live Twice, which was released in 1967. I talked in the end of the last video about Thunderball about how Vietnam is particularly a harbinger of how the 1960s were changing. While the other films usually paid some limited fealty to reality, You Only Live Twice retreats into total fantasy. The concept of the picture is basically to take the James Bond formula and punch it up as high as it would possibly go. Bigger sets, bigger stunts, more gadgets, more women, more exotic locations, and as little reality as possible. I find You Only Live Twice fascinating because of its setting. Japan, in the 1960s, was finally getting on its feet after the devastation of World War II and the economic rebuilding principally funded by the United States. In 1946, Japan was a pile of smoking rubble. In 1956, it was an impoverished society struggling back from the brink. But by 1966, when they filmed You Only Live Twice in Japan, the country was starting to look like something once again. In fact, it was Japan's massive industrial capacity, which was starting to come online in the mid-1960s, that ultimately spelled doom for American manufacturing. This is the big bust that hits mainly in the early 1970s, which changed American society forever. There's no hint of this, of course, in You Only Live Twice, but the film does provide a very fascinating glimpse of what Japan looked like at that time. Space makes a big comeback in the Bond series in You Only Live Twice. Blofeld's plan in this film is basically the same as it was in Dr. No. Hijack US and Soviet space rockets and cause havoc in eventually World War III. In 1966 and 1967, when the film was being made, the United States was going full bore on the Moon program, and the Gemini space project, which was designed to test hardware and techniques for the Apollo moonshot, that was constantly in the news. So this film, if you've seen it, of course, is just pure escapist entertainment. It also takes the traditional Bond movie formula about as far as it can go. Once you have space rockets in a hollowed-out volcano and a helicopter that fits into a couple of suitcases, where do you really go from there? You Only Live Twice was in many ways the last gasp of the old Bond films, which would have to innovate if they were going to survive, especially after Sean Connery announced during the making of the film that he was quitting the role of James Bond. This threw a monkey wrench into the whole series. By 1967, Connery was one of the biggest stars in the world, but fame had begun to grate on him a little bit. You can tell, even more so than in Thunderball, that he's not having fun in the role at all, and he's just collecting a paycheck. You Only Live Twice premiered in June 1967. By this time, major ground combat had been going on in Vietnam for almost 2 years. Protests against the war were everywhere in America, and a tide of political violence and social deconstruction was barely being held in check. Those factors would erupt with a vengeance the next year, 1968. 1967 was also tumultuous in Europe. There were numerous demonstrations which turned into riots and strikes. The famous Red Army faction, better known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang, a terrorist group, got its start in West Germany. During this period, changes were seeping everywhere, from the effect of widely available birth control pills in the US, introduced in the US in 1960, to fashion changes. We have lots of bright colors, eye-popping patterns, men wearing their hair long, kind of like I do. This was all a lot to take in. Clearly, historically, a lot had changed in just 5 years since the first Bond film came out. This is a crossroads of the series, and as things become violent and ugly on both sides of the Atlantic in 1968, the question was, could James Bond survive the 60s? I will turn to that question in the next video about the movie On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share.